Good afternoon, everyone. We will begin in a few minutes. In the meantime, please complete the poll as listed on the screen. Good afternoon, everyone. We will begin in just a minute. In the meantime, please complete the poll as listed on the screen. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, Destructive and Unexpected: What Funders Should Know About Wildfire Recovery. My name is Natalie Chang, she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Innovation and Special Projects for CDP. As a California resident, this topic hits home for me. Many friends were personally affected by these wildfires in Los Angeles, and we know that our collective vulnerability to wildfires will persist and lead to future events. We all feel an urgency to learn and adapt, and I thank you for joining us in this conversation about the actions we can take. Some housekeeping notes before we get started. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the panel presentation. We are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after it is complete. Live captioning is available now via Zoom. Click on closed caption or live transcript to access it, and these are available in multiple languages. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings and to meet your needs better. This webinar is co-sponsored by Alliance Magazine, Giving Compass, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, Philanthropy California, Philanthropy New York, SoCal Grantmakers, and the Funders Network. Thank you to all of our sponsors. We couldn't have done this without their support and that of the many other organizations that promoted this webinar. As we begin the webinar, CDP acknowledges it works on the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural impacts of colonialism and disasters. The erasure of Indigenous knowledge about how to care for these lands has caused environmental destruction and degradation. CDP is committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy and their connections to philanthropy today and in the future. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us in acknowledging the original peoples and their elders and past, present, and future generations. At the end of this webinar, donors will appreciate how past disasters in California can influence recovery in 2025. Learn how the diversity of California's population will impact who can access aid, and understand how California's housing and insurance crisis will create challenges. Now let's look at the results of our survey. In response to the first question, have you or your organization ever funded wildfire recovery efforts before in California or elsewhere? It looks like a majority of respondents, 53%, said yes, 25% said no, 9% said unsure, and 13% said not applicable. It's wonderful. Whether or not you have prior funding experience, you'll leave this webinar with a much better idea of what wildfire recovery looks like. Now, in response to the second question, how familiar are you with the unique disaster recovery challenges in California? 21% said very familiar, 61% said somewhat familiar, and 18% said not at all familiar. Thank you for your participation, as I know our conversation will touch on many dimensions of disaster recovery that are unique to California. Now, I want to share some data with you before we begin our discussion. As of yesterday, February 11th, CAL FIRE reports that there have been 359 wildfires that reached at least 10 acres each since January 1st of this year. Collectively, they have burned 57,660 acres, and there have been 29 fatalities. 16,248 structures were destroyed, many of them homes. And according to FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, almost 28,400 individual assistance applications have been approved for California wildfires as of the same date, at a total obligation of $71.4 million. Now, while that sounds like a lot of money, it only comes to an average of $2,517.45 per household. In the Eaton fire in Pasadena and Altadena, 1,074 structures were damaged and 9,413 structures were destroyed. There were 17 civilian fatalities and 9 firefighters were injured. About 14,000 acres burned in total. In the Palisades fire in the Pacific Palisades neighborhood of the city of Los Angeles, 973 structures were damaged and 6,833 structures were destroyed. There were 12 civilian fatalities, 3 civilian injuries, and 1 firefighter injury. 23,707 acres burned. Now, it is my honor to introduce our special guests. I am looking forward to the information they will share with us. Nina Kanira is the California Area Manager for Climate Resilience and Disaster Preparedness at CORE, which stands for Community Organized Relief Effort, where she links multiple communities in the areas of urban greening, food waste and recovery, wildfire mitigation, and disaster preparedness. Nina is a first-generation Mexican-American and the only one to graduate from university. She began her sustainability and climate career 8 years ago after a professional shift away from law practice and working with asylum seekers in LA. Katie Simmons is a Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for Butte County, where she oversees emergency management and long-term recovery programs following catastrophic wildfires. Her experience includes navigating recurrent disaster impacts and setting up long-term recovery programs, using a trauma-informed approach to reduce re-traumatization during recovery, and working with federal and state agencies on recovery funding. Dr. Rose Villegas leads the California Community Foundation Wildfire Recovery Fund, where she is also Director of Health Programs. She has over 20 years of experience working in implementation science and health promotion. Welcome to each of you, and thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us. Rose, I'd like to start with you. I shared some statistics we know about the wildfires, but you told me last week, numbers tell a story, but there are numbers we don't know. What data is missing, and when might you have that data?
Thank you very much, Natalie, and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy for bringing us together today. The numbers that we don't have, but we absolutely need in order to address the needs of the communities impacted by the wildfires in LA County, 2 numbers that I think will be essential. One, how do we measure trust and collaboration as we move forward into the full recovery, rebuilding, and ultimately resilience phases? I was listening to a Philanthropy California presentation last week, and all the presenters underscored the issue of trust, building trust. How do we measure trust? This is a number that few of us know how to measure. And so how do we assess that both qualitatively and quantitatively? And then the other number really is, what does displacement look like? And we know from studies that were done about a year after the Paradise Fire, campfire in the Paradise community, that displacement came out in waves. And so we're still enumerating what displacement looks like in LA County.
Thank you, Rose. Nina, as a Los Angeles-based organization, CORE quickly responded to the fires. Can you share the various types of programs you offer during and after a disaster?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate CDP hosting this webinar, especially so soon after the fires. I think the sooner we can talk about it, the better. So just going back to CORE, which stands for Community Organized Relief Effort, we're an international organization, but also based here in Los Angeles and work on many, multiple different catastrophic weather events, hurricanes, wildfires, floods across the nation. But this one really hit home, as we are based here in California, and also had my own perspective on this. CORE really stepped up and, from the moment the fire started happening, started reaching out to partners, figuring out what kind of resources would be needed, knowing that it was still a very active event. One of the things that volunteer organizations do is they take cues from the first responders. They don't just go in automatically and try to fill gaps. They figure out, and CORE figured out what was needed. And so what we did is help staff the different evacuation centers, the one on the west side and the one in Pasadena, giving out hygiene kits, other sorts of personal items, things that might be needed, things for like diapers, formula, water. And then also we did hand out cash. So what we're doing is basically making a list of those that are needed, that need the cash assistance, and then providing those as cash cards. And as we all know, cash would probably be best for everyone because the family only knows, what they need at the moment. And while all of the other things are also needed in the first 24 hours, after that, you have to start thinking about things like food and gas and where you're going to stay. So that definitely comes in handy. And is what CORE really was focusing on, especially towards the end of the response and long-term recovery.
Thanks, Nina. Katie, what issues arise in recovery that funders and survivors might not consider in the immediate aftermath of the disaster?
Well, thank you so much. I also want to just acknowledge CDP for having us here. This is exactly the sort of webinar I wish I had when I became disaster recovery director after the Camp Fire in the town of Paradise. So it's a pleasure to be here. In the immediate aftermath of disaster, no one's really thinking about the realities of recovery, how expensive and complex it's really going to turn out to be. It's very hard to see at the outset. In our experience, for example, survivors may need 1 to 2 years to begin processing through the basics, to begin itemizing their insurable losses if their insurance company requires that, figuring out if they can rebuild, but also if they want to rebuild, removing debris from their property. During this time, I think awareness of what's to come helps survivors and communities avoid costly mistakes that can lead to permanent displacement. Insurance proceeds, really the uses of insurance proceeds can be very consequential. Duplication of benefits is a big issue for survivors who spend insurance proceeds, understandably, on temporary housing after a fire, but find they have to replenish those funds years later to qualify for a housing reconstruction subsidy. The rub on insurance is it's technically the first in source of funds for recovery. Federal and state agencies really only want public funds to fill private gaps. And so, really understanding the exclusions of federal and state and insurance funds is the best way to go about identifying how to spend charitable funds. So to begin to understand some long-term needs at the outset, sort of maybe, contact local building and planning departments and ask about what are those hidden barriers to reconstruction that survivors may not be aware of that they might need assistance to sort through. These can be recording surveys, legally determining lot lines. People believe they own their property and then they lose their property and suddenly they find out they own the parcel next to, fire reveals all sorts of land issues. And so, just getting a building permit can be prohibitively expensive, let alone repairing septic and wells if you're in rural areas. So I would say early on, protect state and federal resources by understanding their best and highest required use and fund around it, avoid what I call the windfall of no, which is the recapture or loss of federal and state funds because no one really knows how to use them at first, and then help survivors understand when and how to spend or save insurance proceeds as they build out their short-term and long-term recovery plans.
Thanks, Katie. I think you're starting to sketch out the complexity of what survivors need to navigate in the immediate aftermath. Rose, I have a question for you. Who are you most concerned about falling through the cracks, and what strategies are needed to reach them?
Thank you for the question, Natalie. So as part of the Los Angeles County wildfires, we saw almost 30 fatalities, many of them seniors, individuals who were in their homes and could not be evacuated or did not receive notifications about the need to evacuate. And so LA County and many other jurisdictions in the state of California does not have a registry of individuals who are aging, have functional mobility issues, or are living with disabilities. I think the story that has captured most of our hearts is Mr. Mitchell and his son, who were trapped in his home. And many of you could probably look up that story. They were awaiting rescue. And so these are the individuals for whom there are no numbers. There is no notification, sub alert specifically for seniors and people with disabilities. These are the groups that we know there are no numbers on this. I spoke with our LA County Department of Aging and Disabilities, and our director there said that they've gathered over 40 agencies to advocate to the state of California around ensuring that there are evacuation plans explicitly articulated in future disaster efforts here in the state of California. And so those are communities that we're particularly concerned about. And also, I think, given we're LA County, we're particularly concerned about communities that do not wish to be found right now because of executive orders and other federal actions threatening immigrant communities across the United States.
Thank you, Rose. Katie, coming back to you, can you tell us about this spectrum of funding outside of charitable dollars that is available for communities and families to help with recovery?
Yeah, absolutely. So anyone working in wildfire recovery will tell you that the pace and scale of individual recovery, which is the restoration of housing, really hinges upon the presence of private insurance at the time of disaster. It's becoming harder and harder, I think, for California homeowners to obtain insurance. Homeowners and renters without insurance or adequate insurance really rely on charitable funds and subsidies for recovery. For federally declared disasters, which the LA County fires are, and several of ours have been as well, when certain thresholds are met, FEMA makes individual assistance available to individuals and public assistance available to local agencies. FEMA IA can take months to arrive, is usually capped around $25,000 and is not enough to restore permanent housing. FEMA public assistance can be spent by local governments on eligible projects like road reconstruction, but those often require multiple funding sources and therefore multiple environmental reviews. With the federal disaster declaration, Congress may also appropriate community development block grant funds, which are essentially last-in funds that are administered by HUD. It typically comes 5 years after FEMA, though it is meant to bridge the gap for unmet needs. Federal and state funds for recovery are all reimbursement based, so cash flowing projects is often the responsibility of local government. And, oftentimes cash flowing means looking for non-competing funding sources to be able to pay for recovery while local governments wait for reimbursement. For disasters without a declaration, the responsibility of individual recovery is really on survivors, and community recovery is really the responsibility of local government and organizations. Even if the state makes programs available to survivors, in non-declared disasters like debris and tree removal, 25% of the cost share may be the responsibility of the local government, which is in all cases related to disaster and unplanned expense. If a wildfire is caused by criminal negligence, settlement funds may be another source of funding for recovery. One of the things I like to make sure to mention about settlement funds, though, is they typically flow through a trust, are tied to third-party determinations on claims filed by survivors and are often doled out in payments versus lump sum upfront payments, and are rarely, if ever, enough to fund recovery on their own. So this isn't an exhaustive list of all the funds available for recovery. I think what I wanted to emphasize here is that knowing how to combine funding sources, knowing which funds can and can't interact together within projects, understanding and anticipating that cash flow piece for the reimbursability of disaster recovery, and then how to finance long-term recovery. Those are just as important as knowing how much money you have to work with.
Thanks, Katie. So let's move to the charitable funding piece. What's available and why might funders want to consider giving as locally as possible in their grant making?
Thank you. I think this is an excellent question. So funders should consider creating equity for survivors with their wildfire recovery giving. Not all fires are equal in scale nor equal in the types of resources that come in for recovery, but all homes lost are equally destroyed. So I like to really emphasize that. Fires that make international news often draw donations from across the globe. Our 2018 Camp Fire, which resulted in the loss of almost 19,000 structures, generated $75 million in charitable funds. Our Park Fire in 2024, which was the fourth largest in state history, destroyed 428 structures and drew just over 100,000 for survivors. So fires that fall below the media threshold, particularly those in rural areas, are often critically under-resourced. The amount of giving should absolutely be proportionate to the scale of destruction and level of need, and should take into account the other sources of funding triggered by the magnitude of the disaster. So I mentioned, massive federally declared disasters will generate sources of federal and state funds. Smaller scale disasters may have nothing beyond local resources for recovery. Charitable dollars may go further in smaller scale disasters when there's little risk of duplicating federal and state benefits and a critical lack of subsidies. So I just wanted to sort of show that not all survivors are dealing with the same level of resources based upon the scale of the disaster. And so those are a couple of things I think to consider. Before making funding decisions, inquire about the uses and sources of other funding available for recovery and kind of confirm those unfunded survivor needs. Social media and news sources, just in our experience, it's impossible to capture the complexity of funding recovery. It is. I mean, I do this for a living and it takes me hours to explain CDBG-DR infrastructure recovery funding. And so, looking at the news, kind of listening to stories may not give you the full picture. So talk with trusted local agencies, talk with governments about gaps in PA projects, talk with a trusted local source like a community foundation that can make donations directly to survivors in schools and locally vetted groups. And I think most importantly, ensure the flexibility for the charitable giving. Give those in charge of recovery the ability to make decisions about how to use those charitable funds. Oftentimes in recovery, charitable funds are the only source of discretionary spending in recovery. Every other funding source is tightly controlled and restricted and reimbursement based. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. So Rose, on our planning call, you discussed a strategy you employ that considers your next steps in increments of fives. Can you explain what this means?
Yes. So we have a team of 5, not that that's the reason for the increments of 5s, but in order to focus our work through the phases of relief, recovery, rebuilding, and resilience, we're thinking about what do we need to do in the next 5 minutes? So that's during the emergency phase, getting grants out very quickly. The California Community Foundation made grants within 10 days of the LA County wildfires. Our team came together on day 1. And so we coach ourselves and say, what do we need to do in the next 5 minutes? What do we need to do in the next 5 hours by the end of the day to ensure that we're responding to the needs in our community? What do we need to do in the next 5 days? So we're already pre-planning for our next phase of work, and then 5 weeks, 5 months, and so on. So our focus in the Wildfire Recovery Fund at the California Community Foundation is on mid to long-term recovery. And so we have adopted the FEMA National Disaster Recovery Framework, which allows us to anticipate anticipate and plan for much of what Katie and Butte County has said. And so we're grateful to, I think, the FEMA framework, because it allows us to be planful, even as we've just made our first tranche of $15 million in grants. We're about to announce, I believe, before the end of this week, another $15 million in grants for LA County wildfire relief and response. And so we've raised about 65 million, as I understand. And we know that the long haul really will be to preserve and apply the remaining funds that are raised to the long-term recovery. And we've learned as well through our partnerships with Butte County, Ventura, Santa Barbara County, and other local areas, Southern California regions.
Nina, turning to you, you lead the climate work for CORE in California, including wildfire mitigation and preparedness. Can you give us an example of what this work looks like and how the LA fires have changed your thinking on what's most critical in this area?
Thank you so much. I know my title has a lot of words in it. And when I was initially started this position, I realized that all of these things really blend together. You can't have a conversation about climate and extreme weather without talking about preparedness, without talking about mitigation, without talking about adaptation. And then on the other side, when a disaster does hit, the response, the recovery, and then the long-term recovery. So the way I see all of these kind of blending together is that it only funding only one piece of it, where right now we're in the phase, at least with the fires, Palisade fires and Eaton fires, and sort of still in recovery. And we really haven't moved into the long-term recovery yet. People are still processing, just as Rose had mentioned, processing, and Kate also, just the overwhelming amount of things that have to be done, along with taking care of your own emotional and mental health, and those are the people that you love around you. So I would say that the work that we've done in urban greening, community gardens, planting trees, and speaking with different groups, especially in urban settings, but also in rural settings, is that the actions that you take in the environment around you will have an impact on what happens with the extreme weather as it comes. As we've learned through many decades of different infrastructure plans that have been put in place, where corners might have been cut, disadvantaged communities definitely have been impacted more because of delays in infrastructure, pavement work, stormwaters, things like that, which will increase the impact of any kind of extreme weather that happens. While we're talking about wildfire here, I'd like to mention that the funding and the work that goes into both the preparedness side, as well as recovery and post-recovery and long-term recovery, is good for any type of disaster. So you can be talking about a flood, you can talk about power outages, long-term power outages, big storms, as well as wildfire, even earthquakes, which we like to kind of push that one to a side because it hasn't happened in a very long time, but it will. No one knows exactly when, but it will happen. And so keeping those types of disasters and things at the forefront is what we continue to do. So I really see it as like a continuum of conversation. When we go into communities and actually talk about preparedness, we start off with meeting people where they're at. We don't, dive into, well, you need to not use plastic straws anymore and get yourself an EV and, this, that, and whatever, and make your go bag. The point is not to add things to people who are already just struggling, day to day to feed their families and keep a roof over their head in normal times. So it's really about a conversation about meeting people where they're at. And what I'd really like to say with funding is that funding along this entire stream is not going to be lost on what the impact is when a disaster comes. And so having preparedness conversations also includes preparing people on the business side of things or their home financial side of things. So we do talk to people about wildfire insurance, about flood insurance, making sure that everyone understands what it covers, what it doesn't cover. And then in the same conversation, we're also talking to them about what goes in a go bag. So, or, how trees can be planted in a parkway in their street, and they can just ask for it from the city or from the state. So there's a lot of different conversations that happen. And I just really want the funders to know that money doesn't have to go to a specific targeted disaster as it occurs, especially whenever it may be full flush with cash from other areas, the federal government, FEMA. But the post recovery and long-term recovery really falls on a lot of the nonprofits, the volunteer organizations active in disaster, where the money flows to. That's what's really happening on the ground. Organizations like like CORE, like Team Rubicon, like Catholic Charities, we're all VOADs, and we get the notification of people that are in need. So if we don't have funding to help those people either rebuild or navigate, the long-term recovery aspects of FEMA and other federal funds, then there isn't anyone to help them. So I would suggest having community organized information sessions to have people come to and sit down and talk, because as Katie mentioned, this is so complex. I have a law degree, and I am, in a current situation where it's so puzzling and it's so complex that it's really hard to know. I had a phone call this morning from an insurance adjuster, and it didn't make any sense. They just talked to someone 2 days ago. So I was like, is this a fraud call? I don't understand why I'm receiving another call. So I guess the point is, know what you're funding and ask the hard questions. See, not only who's going to be receiving those funds, but how. Are people going to be educated about what to do with that money? Just as Katie had mentioned, you don't want to have duplication of benefits, and then all of a sudden people are, startled and afraid of what might happen if those funds are clawed back.
Thanks, Nina. I know you're speaking to how this is not just professional, but it's personal for you. And I know you lost your home in the fire. From a personal perspective, can you share with our audience what you hope funders will do to help your community?
Yes, and thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's, as I mentioned before, it's definitely been a whirlwind, even for, my husband and I both, educated adults. We have 2 children. Lived in the Palisades for over 8 years, and the shock of your whole world upended is one thing, and then the work that has to begin is another. And trying to sort of switch off one mind and turn on the other is extremely difficult. And luckily, I have a partner, and so when one of us is not up to do it, the other one sort of takes the reins. So what I would say as a person, fortunately, because of my work and the things that we do, we did have insurance, fully covered for our property and the value of all of our items and everything we had. I also had an additional rider insurance on valuable things like, expensive jewelry and things like that, if they get lost, you would need to prove their value. So I was in a unique case, right? I wish, that other people would have had some of the same information, not just the go bag and, the preparation ahead of time, when to leave, where to meet, things like that, but also just understanding from the outset, not when the event happens, but before. And that's what I'm talking about, preparedness. Beforehand, people will know, okay, in one place, I have all the information for my insurance. I know what my coverages are. I know what the deductibles will be. I understand what FEMA can and cannot fund. I understand what other local community organizations I can reach out to, not just the big names like Red Cross and Salvation Army, but local churches, local, nonprofit organizations. As the climate crisis continues to worsen and will continue to worsen, those community organizations and the people that run them really understand and know best what the individuals need. Some of the best information we received was through Instagram or a text chain of other people situated in my neighborhood, and that is information that came to us. We didn't know where to look, but because we were all talking to each other, got that information. So from a personal perspective, I would just say that the preparedness piece cannot be pushed aside. I know we're in recovery right now and looking at long-term recovery and what that means, and there's an eagerness to fund that. But this work will continue. The work that I do will continue, and I being here today is part of that work to sort of hit home with everyone that I don't even know what the numbers are, but for every dollar spent, on preparedness and some sort of mitigation or looking at infrastructure ahead of time, things like looking at water. This lesson about the water pressure, not that there wasn't enough water, but the water pressure in the hills was a known issue. I mean, this was looked at back in like 1969 with the Bel Air and Brentwood fires, where they had the exact same problem. So learning from our history is also really important. And so, I don't know, I don't have an answer, for how we can all, put all this information together, but I do feel like I've got a good perspective now on how to really prepare people and then how to fund this long-term recovery with the types of organizations that have boots on the ground and really understanding that these dollars are going to repair homes, rebuild homes, have people find, long-term or short-term, shelter, which we're in a short-term, place right now. And I don't know if you saw me looking up, but I think there might be a leak in my room. So, it was leaking the other day, so I'm just hoping that it doesn't occur again. I know the side, but anyway, I'm also trying to keep lighthearted and look at things like, hey, this isn't the end of the world. Like we're gonna keep moving forward. We're gonna keep doing this work, and having the ability to move forward, not with like trudging moving forward, but really trying to thrive and talk about the opportunities, talk about hiring people from the community to run different programs, because they know best and understand it best. And that's really a framework for the work we've been doing all throughout California. Bisbee County, which is very close to Butte County up north, is an example of that, where the conversations that we have on the community level really go so much farther than sending out mailers or having people pick up pamphlets at a farmer's market. I could go on, but thank you.
Thank you, Nina. So we are going to move to the Q&A section, and I want to start with a quick round robin question for all of you. And we'll try to keep this to one sentence if possible. What is one suggestion you have for funders when you consider the trauma folks have experienced? And I'll start with you, Nina, as someone who has just gone through this, but Katie and Rose, you can speak to this from experience as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I'll go back to community again. Some of the people that have gone through the same things that we have, and maybe not necessarily in this moment, but previous. I reached out to people who were personally impacted by the Camp Fire, as someone that I knew who had been through this process, everything from like the moment you were trying to gather your things to, realizing that your home is gone. And that person that I spoke to offered more salient advice, and not just practical, but also emotional, and sort of taught me a couple of tools that I could use in just everyday life with my family, with working with other individuals, with being on, on a forum like this. And yeah, I think that that's really what it boils down to.
Thanks, Katie.
My one sentence is assume the presence of trauma and then multiply it by 1 million and then add a decade on to when you think it might be over. And I write a lot about trauma-informed approach for consultants working with wildfire impacted communities, and my paper that I saw was posted in the chat. So there's more information there. Thanks.
Rose.
So I'll lean on the fives. In 5 minutes, fund behavioral health. In 5 days, fund behavioral health. In 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years. CCF, which has operated the Wildfire Recovery Fund since 2003, during the Camp Fire, funded the Butte County Department of Behavioral Health. We also funded during the Woolsey fires efforts around mental health and community counseling services. We are funding in LA County multi-year behavioral health capacity expansion because our local Department of Mental Health does not have funds available for disaster mental health services.
Thank you to all of you. So we are going to move into the Q&A section, and we've received several questions in advance. I'll be working through that list of questions as well as the ones we're seeing in the Q&A box. So as a reminder, CDP webinars are aimed at providing education for the philanthropic community. So while all are welcome to pose a question, we will first focus on those addressing donor issues. So Rose, I think we'll take a question from the Q&A box first. And it was around speaking to how we can help the workers, for example, housekeepers, home health workers, gardeners, pool services workers, many of whom might be undocumented or in mixed status homes who are now displaced for work and afraid to raise their hands for help.
Absolutely. So as part of our first tranche of grants, the first 15 million granted out from the LA County Wildfire Recovery Fund, we made multiple grants for displaced workers. So these are individuals who lost their employment or their employer was no longer able to operate. And this included organizations such as the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, which provides legal assistance as well as leading the rapid response right now with regard to the mass deportations that are being threatened across the United States. We've also funded Indigenous language organizations to reach individuals for whom there often are not in language forms of assistance to seek cash relief or economic relief with regard to disasters. And then I'll highlight a couple others: National Domestic Workers Alliance and Filipino Worker Center of Southern California. These are organizations that our Community Foundation has worked with for many years with regard to immigrants' rights, particularly for mixed immigration status households or other communities that, as I mentioned, do not wish to be found right now.
And I would add to that, just thinking about our long-term recovery needs is case managers who can walk with survivors from, almost the time of disasters all the way through what reconstruction or permanent housing, what their permanent housing solution looks like. So we had a lot of charitable funds come in to our local foundation who funded case management. And that was sometimes, Nina was talking about her own experience. She and her husband have resources and access to information that's been very helpful. For households who don't have access to information or resources, having that case manager come in and walk alongside them through the multi-year process can be very helpful. And charitable funds are often best used in that regard.
And I'll just echo that as well, because there are programs that FEMA has put in place, and I think Katie had mentioned those earlier, where it's, or maybe it was Rose, it was more of a framework in place. And while FEMA's sort of disaster case management has its own policies and rules and regulations around it and how much money is put in to that funding, I definitely echo, what Katie said, where philanthropic dollars need to also augment what's going on there, because just like we mentioned with, immigrants or people who are not, not trusting, if we talked about the word trust, of government programs, are just going to not sign up, right? They're just not going to show up to those types of events or raise their hands saying if they need help. While the government hasn't explicitly said that, at least not yet, that help can't go to those individuals, you can understand why they would fear that. So the philanthropic dollars that go to augment disaster case management and case management in general, again, should, I believe, come through trusted community organizations, because again, these groups may not trust someone who even said, hey, your name's not going to be sent to the government, we're here to help you. If it doesn't come through a voice that they recognize, whether it's a church, a community center, or some other organization that has a trusted status in that, in those areas, then they may not show up at all.
Thanks. So switching gears a little bit, I wanted to ask Katie a question around home hardening. So there's a lot been written about strategies or tactics that homeowners can use to protect and resist wildfire damage. Could you speak to that a little bit based on your experience?
Yeah, I had a little bit of trouble with the audio for that, but I think you were talking about mitigation, home hardening. Yeah, so Nina was mentioning the ratio of, for every dollar that is invested in mitigation, I think the current is 1 to 11. So for every dollar you invest in mitigation, you save $11 on the recovery side. We just update our local hazard mitigation plan, which is required by FEMA to be eligible for hazard mitigation funds post-disaster. So that's tied into FEMA public assistance. And so make sure the government has that sort of plan structure in place to create eligibility for mitigation dollars pre and post-disaster. And then home hardening is critically important. What we're not seeing yet is that insurance discount yet coming in to offset those dollars invested in home hardening, but it's absolutely necessary. I think I like to avoid language around, to prevent wildfires. Like I don't say that, right? I say to reduce the loss of life and property in the event of a wildfire. So I think, when we talk about mitigation, when we talk about resilience, we should be very careful about what we mean and what we're signaling to survivors. And I think home hardening is absolutely one way people can invest in the safety of their property. But if their next door neighbor has 5 acres of wooded, unmanaged wooded property, and there's the, so it has to be communal. We have to make resources available for everyone to make those investments, and then we have to see the discount on the insurance side to make the investment worth it. And so I would say, yeah, mitigation is necessary.
Could I
Thank
add
you.
something really quickly there?
Yes, please.
Absolutely. I echo everything that Katie said. Something that we found out in the field and talking to especially rural residents is not only is there a hesitancy to abide by whatever kind of laws are in place or regulations are in place with what they can do with their own property. It's more about what Katie mentioned is saying, hey, we're just talking about how to reduce the risk of of losing your home completely or having to, do repairs that would otherwise not have to be done if, the defensible space was increased or, some of the trees around the home were trimmed or limbed up. So, you would think that everyone, says, okay, this is common sense. If I put in some investment and some changes to my house and property that, I'll see that result on the other side. But being very, very careful to say this is not making your home or your property fireproof. Nothing is fireproof. Maybe some equipment or something with the firefighters, but generally, the type of siding, the type of roofs, the building out with no eaves, things like that, definitely will help. But there's no such thing as like fireproof. We talk about fire resistant, things like that.
Thanks. So we've received several questions about the connections between philanthropy and the current administration. And I see in our Q&A box, there are some questions about the future of FEMA and the role of philanthropy and kind of advocating or filling in the gaps. So I wanted to ask this of Rose and Katie, and then Nina, feel free to jump in. For you first, Rose, how are funders preparing to navigate waters between wildfire recovery and emerging administration orders?
It's a very important question and one that we're actively considering and engaging around. So I'll offer this. I think there's another question in the Q&A about what preparedness philanthropy has for this. So the estimate of the costs of damage, making LA County whole is the low ball is $250 billion today. That number is likely to balloon as we understand what the costs of supply chain interruptions and construction and labor will likely increase over the coming years. So philanthropy is absolutely engaged now because we know that our county partners, our governmental partners, do not have the cash flow in order to respond. Philanthropy is responding to small businesses that have been impacted. We're currently looking at small business and worker interruption relief funds to support the many hundreds of small businesses that employ folks here in LA County. There's also vibrant aerospace and technology sectors in LA County. As folks know, there's one technology company that lost 150 of their workers lost homes or had damaged homes during the LA County wildfires. So we believe that protecting these businesses and industries, as well as the communities that a community foundation is always responsible for, are part of a bridge and opportunity to engage with our federal administration around what recovery, rebuilding, and resilience looks like in LA County.
Yeah, and for me, I like to emphasize that recovery doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is not happening in a protected vacuum where you are free from the pressures of everything else, right? So, just as someone who's working in disaster recovery, I may have issues at home. And as Nina was saying, trying to set up appropriate boundaries. So when we were about a year and a half into recovery from the campfire, COVID hit, right? Major disruption, lots of uncertainty, absolute supply chain impacts. The cost of lumber tripled, quadrupled. Suddenly the cost of reconstruction almost overnight was double, triple. So I think that, though I can't answer questions on, Natalie, you asked some great questions. I'm sure they're in the Q&A. I don't have answers to those questions, but what I can say is, for us here in Butte County, we're recovering from multiple federally declared disasters. We're having flooding, as we speak. And it's very much just sort of business as usual for us in terms of staying focused on recovery and what we can control, what our board has authority over. And then recognizing that no recovery process is invulnerable to the many different forces that are out there that are impacting our communities and our economy. And, so you have to stay, someone said to me once, stay loose in the saddle, right? You have to sort of make sure that you're moving through it, through all those unplanned interruptions with some foresight if you can have it, but just a lot of flexibility and a lot of focus on what you have control over.
Thank you. I'd also like to add workforce development is something that I know as a term has sort of been tossed around as a good to have, a nice to have. Right now, we're at a critical point and a critical juncture in how we develop young people who are in high school, in college, post-college, or those who are not going on the college track and will need, individuals on both sides. So I would say also another area to look at is workforce development, because we have created programs, and we've learned this, CORE has learned this, working in other international arenas as well, is that when you come into an area and there is going to be, an absence of, capable people to do the work, there's a lot going on as far as the bulldozers and everything that are moving, the debris and ash and toxic materials out of the place, for instance, in the Palisades, and we'll be doing so in the Eaton fire. But then what comes after that? You'll have, they're individuals, they're people that come in that, do the, check out from an EPA and toxic regulation standpoint to figure out, is it even safe to rebuild here? Is it even safe to have workers on the ground? But then also, when Katie talked about, from a materials perspective, labor, definitely tends to be the highest cost, and it goes even higher when you don't have enough people to do the work. So investing in workforce development within the communities and in the towns is something that we've looked at. We've gone through programs like the California Conservation Corps and other types of programs that help individuals seek out this type of work, get trained, get certified, and go on to have careers and pay that is commensurate with what the work that they're doing. And talking about immigration and all of those other issues that are going to impact our daily lives, workforce is going to be one of those, because most often there are individuals working on construction sites or in other types of areas that may not have their documents all in order, or have everything that they would need, say if they had to show their paperwork on demand, and so that may create a shortage as well. And so again, just investing in our young people and people who are looking to cross over from an employment status and a career status, and really having those people who know their communities best stay, in the economy, rebuild the economy, and then also work within it and, rebuild in a way that is good for all, not just for those who can afford it.
Thanks, Nina. I wanted to ask one of the questions in the Q&A box, specifically about children and young people. And maybe Rose, you can take this one. What services are available to help children who have experienced the fires?
We know that childcare was severely interrupted as a result of the LA County wildfires. And so some of the grants that we've made are to youth serving organizations. So you'll see Boys and Girls Clubs as well as the Y. So the YMCA of Metro LA is the fiscal sponsor for multiple YMCAs in the region. And so those organizations opened up as childcare sites and are providing families with assistance. So CCF immediately responded and understood that was going to be an interrupted case. And then to the point around small businesses, we have many home-based childcare providers who do not have the benefit of insurance in order to recoup their costs. And these are often operated by low income or low wage workers, many of them women, ethnic minority women, some immigrant families. And so we know these are small businesses that will also need assistance during this period. So we've made commitments to funding the Child Care Alliance of LA, which is about a dozen orgs that provide childcare resources, as well as supporting youth behavioral health, because those childcare sites may not have the resources to be able to address the immediate through long-term trauma and recovery needs of young people who have gone through the wildfires.
I would just say really quickly, I mean, the immediate piece for children is just triage, right? So we had school kids who were attending second grade in an old Ace Hardware aisle that was curtained off, right? For 22 kids for a whole year. And so kids are in triage mode for a long time because their day-to-day is interrupted if their school has been impacted. So when I think about philanthropic giving, I think about long-term recovery needs. I think about coming back around several years later and making sure those kids are okay because they're in survival mode times 10, right? They have no control over their environment and their day-to-day. And so kids need that loop back around to make sure they're okay after the triage period of recovery, response and recovery are over.
I have one last thing to add, if I may. I reread the question. I was like, are there any last thoughts? And I would say this, and it's, something that is universal. As far as applying for money, being a nonprofit and applying for money for doing these types of programs, and not specifically with youth in a trauma-based way right now, but looking at all of these funds are not just given away, right? There's some criteria that you have to meet, there's applications that you have to go through, and many of them are incredibly complex. And so, in the world of giving and philanthropy, and also, federal and state dollars, it's a complaint that a lot of organizations have. But I will say, even with, a team of experts who know how to do this and know how to fill out grant applications, it's still very hard to get a hold of those dollars. So I don't know if it's a change in how this money is looked at, that it's not just a who writes the best application, or who's got the the PhD on their team that can pull all the data together and make it look fancy and sharp. But I would recommend having somebody on the philanthropic team actually work with these applicants. It's not a what goes on behind the curtain kind of thing. Like, we all know what work needs to be done, and having this division between the the individuals and the organizations that need the money and the organizations that have the money, it's sometimes too hard to overcome. So I would say, however, somebody can be innovative and figuring out how to help these organizations along. And I know that there's technical assistance and things like that, and I will tell you that those are not as helpful as we think that they are. But from the organizations themselves, if they have, hire a person who works with community members or works with organizations to say, hey, this is really what we're looking for. If you can, put this together and prove to us that this is something you can do, then okay, we're going to give you the money, rather than having, this application that everybody has to fill out and it's scored on a 1 through 5 basis. And, yeah, so that would be my last words. Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. So CDP definitely supports this, and we can help funders do that through our expert advisory services. I want to thank all of you so much, and I'm sorry that's all the time we have for questions today. And as we wrap up, I do want to provide the audience with some actionable thoughts from our conversation. The first is to identify and support at-risk populations. I think we've heard a lot about that on this discussion. To achieve high-quality grant making, please conduct assessments to identify the most marginalized and at-risk groups in the affected areas. And this will really enable you to allocate your funds specifically to programs supporting these populations to help ensure their preparation for the next disaster. The second is to carry out localized grant making. Before disasters, please prioritize local grant making to ensure funds directly benefit the affected communities. Collaborations with local organizations with direct access to and experience with these communities will improve the effectiveness of your grant making. And third, implement innovative strategies. It is not always easy to gain attention about disasters when the sky is blue, so to speak. Innovative strategies that link disaster recovery to future planning, preparedness, and mitigation are needed more than ever. Bold investments in resilience and risk reduction are required to rebuild a safer and more equitable future. Philanthropy has a unique role to play in this. Now, this webinar is just one of CDP's many education and knowledge offerings. We provide weekly disaster updates, comprehensive disaster profiles, and issue insights covering U.S. and international disaster topics. Our expert advisory services team can partner with donors who seek customized assistance with disaster giving strategies. And beyond our expert resources, please visit our website to learn about our collaborative funds, including our active California Wildfires Recovery Fund, which provides grants to community organizations focused on equitable long-term recovery. Our next webinar is on March 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern on the topic of disaster preparedness. Why funding before a disaster is crucial. In order to respect everyone's time and keep this to an hour, I know we're a little bit over. This is all the time we have for today. I want to thank you for joining. Thank you to our panelists, Rose, Katie, and Nina, for taking the time to share their insights with us. Thank you to our sponsors. And please take a moment to complete our post-webinar survey to let us know what you liked and what you would like to see in future webinars. If you have questions or thoughts that were not addressed, please email them to Tanya at tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you and have a great afternoon.